G20 Summit with world leaders coming to New Delhi this week. Union Minister of State for Electronics and Information Technology, Rajeev Chandrasekhar, spoke exclusively to me earlier today about the summit, India's unique G20 presidency, his ministry's role in it, the country's transformative digitization, India's much touted digital public infrastructure, the technology-driven India story, the technology cooperation expected with some of the G20 member countries, and the potential impact of India's G20 legacy. Listen in to this exclusive conversation. Hello and welcome. You're watching News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna, and joining me today is a very special guest, Union Minister of State for Electronics and Information Technology, Mr. Rajeev Chandrasekhar. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Neha.
Thank you so much for making the time. Let me begin by asking you, India is hosting the G20 Summit. Later this week, the global spotlight will be on the country. Top world leaders are going to descend on our capital. What, according to you, being the host of the G20 Summit means for India's global stature and its place in the new world order?
No, look, I think there's no doubt, Neha, that the Indian presidency of the G20 this last 1 year has certainly left, in my opinion, an extremely strong impression, an indelible impression on the nations of the world in terms of our own values, in terms of how we see the future of the world. And this started with a very simple yet profound statement by our Prime Minister, where he said that, look, this is not the time for war, this is the time for economic development and prosperity for our people. And in a lot of ways, that summarizes how the world should be looking at the next 10, 20 years. That we really should be looking at creating economic opportunity for our people all around the country, all around the world and the country. We should be looking at sustainability, protecting our planet. And so he's laid out his life mission for the world. And I have absolutely no doubt all of that, along with the fact that we are demonstrating the power of technology to empower people, transform their lives via the DPIs that we have. There is a lot of consensus in the G20 about that we can create sustainability, we can think of a peaceful future without conflict, and we can also talk about innovation and improving governance and empowering people with technology. So I think certainly of the many G20 presidencies in the recent times, the Indian presidency certainly will rank up there as one of the defining presidencies of the G20 in recent times, at least in my opinion.
It's been called the People's Presidency. But you know, I have to ask you this.
Sure.
The Russian president is not going to attend. Yeah. The Chinese president is not going to attend. What do you make of the fact that Xi Jinping has chosen to skip this summit? And there are those who are saying, could the absence of two important world leaders dent India's G20 summit in any way? How would you look at it? Is it likely to take some of the sheen off it?
So, Neha, this is really not my place to comment on. This is really the External Affairs Ministry that should speak to this, and I would love to restrict myself to talking about the digital economy working group and the digital part of the G20. But just as a spectator to G20, if you want to call me that, I would point out that the Russians are being represented as they were represented in the BRICS by their foreign minister Sergei Lavrov. And the reasons for China's non-presence is best explained by the Chinese. I certainly don't want to go beyond that. But for those who are attending, the countries that are attending, and indeed the countries that are special invitees, and the larger global south, who have been in a sense catalyzed by this year's presidency by India into being more involved into this conversation about DPIs, digital skills, the digital economy, I certainly see absolutely nothing less than absolute excitement in terms of what the future holds for them. So somebody doesn't show up to a party doesn't make the party any less interesting.
Okay, that's interesting. I know you've said you don't want to talk about geopolitics, but as a journalist, I'll still take my chances. It's been said that China has adopted a very obstructionist approach in a lot of the G20 meetings that have taken place so far. The Russian foreign minister has said, we will block the New Delhi declaration if our viewpoint on Ukraine is not incorporated. The question I want to simply ask you is, because you are a senior minister in this government, do you not believe it's going to be a huge headache for India to evolve a consensus on an issue as thorny and polarizing as the Russia-Ukraine war? Given these sharp differences that exist, there are some who are even asking, will there be a New Delhi leaders' declaration at the end of it?
So I can't comment on that, and certainly that's way beyond my pay scale, notwithstanding your generous description of me as a senior minister. I am not, and so I don't want to comment on that at all. I will only reiterate what our Honorable Prime Minister has said all along about this conflict, that this is not the time for conflict, and countries who have differences must find a way of negotiating and settling their differences and not going to war and creating despair and pain and suffering and hardship for hundreds and thousands of people. So that our Honorable Prime Minister has said, and I think that is the position India will take. Now, I don't know too much more about the other stuff, that the leaders' declaration and so on and so forth, and that is best answered by, and it is appropriate that our External Affairs Minister answers it. And I will stick to what I know something about, which is a habit of mine, which is technology and the digital economy working.
I promise I will come to that. But since you are talking about the Prime Minister's sage words of advice to President Putin, then this is not an era of war, and those words resonated globally. Do you believe India would want to use the G20 platform to play peacemaker?
I'm not sure. I'm not aware, Neha. I certainly, again, don't want to even suggest something that I have no knowledge about. I think I say with some confidence that India's position is best exemplified by the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam line that India has put forth for its presidency, that the world is one family and that this one earth, one life, one future ought to guide our thinking and thoughts as governments and people for the coming years and decades. So I certainly don't have an inside view on or a glimpse into what will be said and what will not be said in the leaders' declaration. I certainly don't want to hazard a guess.
Okay, I understand that. Now, the Prime Minister's vision is clearly driving India's G20 presidency. He's repeatedly said India is the voice of the global south. We want to push for a more inclusive and equitable growth. There's been a lot of talk about India's transformational digitization as well, showing the way to other countries. As the IT minister of the country who's been greatly involved with India's G20 presidency, let me ask you this. How do you think India is really showing the way in this arena?
I think one of the defining attributes of this presidency by India is that for example, in the whole digital economy space, we have, with our own experience over the last 9 years of building these DPIs, this digital infrastructure, that we are showing how technology can be harnessed by governments in a way that is not very expensive, is not very backbreaking, and achieves the objectives of inclusion, brings more and more people into the framework of governance and benefits and pensions and money and subsidies. And so the DPI story that India today represents at scale, with 1 billion Indians using the DPI that have been constructed by the government, is certainly a beacon for all those countries, including the countries of the global south, that have lagged behind in digital technologies because they thought it's very expensive, that they had to go to big technology companies of the world to digitize their own economies and government. And here India is saying, look, there has to be a partnership and a coalition of countries, and we create a global DPI repository where all of this technology and innovation is made available to anybody who wants it free of cost. And so India has taken a lead in that. India has shown the world, and today we have signed 8 MOUs with 8 different countries to implement the India DPI in their countries and allow them to grow and digitize and expand and innovate. So there is no doubt in my mind, in the technology space, and remember, we are talking about this in the backdrop of a mission to the moon, successful mission to the moon, and almost 5 days later a mission to the sun. Correct. Very few countries today, including in the G20, can boast of that kind of a backdrop and have a communication and conversation about technology as India can. So there is nothing remotely abstract about India's conversations about technology, digital skills, or cyber security. These are very real, backed by very real products and applications, innovations, which India and our Prime Minister are saying we are offering to the world free of cost for their own development and for the progress of people even outside of India.
Yeah. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the National Payments Corporation of India announced recently that the UPI transactions crossed the 10 billion mark in August.
Absolutely.
You speak very passionately about DPI, India's digital public infrastructure. Why do you believe DPI is the fulcrum of the India story? And how exactly is India helping other countries change or transform their own trajectory using this as the foundation?
Neha, I'll tell you why it's such a very important part of the India story, this new India story. When you talk about India today, of course, you talk about 23rd August and you talk about Chandrayaan and you talk about the Aditya L1. But if you talk about a deeper story which most countries relate to, is the story how a country of this size and scale, which for several decades the narrative of dysfunctional governance, where 100 rupees left Delhi and 15 rupees by the admission of a Prime Minister of that time, only 15 rupees reached the beneficiary because of corruption, because of leakage. That India, that story of India of great potential but immense dysfunctionality, which lasted for 6.5 decades, has been transformed simply because of Prime Minister Modi's vision of the power of DPI and power of technology. And so that story is, and that reality today when it is communicated to countries that say, even we have people far away from state capitals. We have people far away and distant from governance institutions. How do we reach them? The DPI is the answer to connecting back governments and citizens in a very foolproof manner, rebuilding trust and between government and citizen in a very strong, robust manner, as India has shown. Whether it is Aadhaar, the identity layer, UPI, the payment layer, DigiLocker, the document authentication layer, eSanjeevani, the health layer, the skill layer, the education layer. So we have built a whole proliferation of applications and technology that allows citizens to avail public services and public benefits in a way that is unprecedented. And it is particularly relevant to India because in the context of India, because for 6.5 decades, people all around the world looked at India and said, "Ye to ek dysfunctional democracy hai. Great people, great country, great culture, great heritage, but the system just doesn't work because it's so corroded and corrupted." And that has been turned on its head 180 degrees through the power of DPI. So therefore, there is a lot of real acknowledgement of the change of India and this changed India. And I see that as something in every meeting that I have with any of these ministers, that they see India as a case study of what can be changed and what can be the potential of a country.
And it's heartening to know, like you said, 8 MOUs have been signed with other countries. Of course, you have said recently that DPI is a force whose time has come and it is unstoppable. I need to ask you one more question about G20 before we move on. Just looking at the big picture, I know you don't want to comment on geopolitics. What do you think India's G20 legacy is likely to be? How's the world likely to remember it?
Look, again, I speak as an individual citizen of India and the world. Look, I see that the traditional values of India, which really had been for many years ignored by the supremacy, let us say, or dominance of Western ideals and Western values. And for many years, the Asian values of family, Asian values of sustainability, India's values of culture, heritage and modernity all being balanced. I think that is all now coming back to center stage. As the West moves to more on discourse of sustainability, effectively that is the language that Indian culture and tradition has been speaking for years. This balance between the planet we live on and the planet that we exploit. So, I hope, it is my fond hope, that we will move into the coming decade with a lot more of a heightened awareness of a lot of these values that India espouses. Development and progress, not conflict. Technology for empowerment of people and not just for exploitation. Inclusion, not exclusion. Not a bipolar or a unipolar world, but multipolar world. So all of these things I think are things that I hope the world moves towards, and I'm not saying this in the context of G20, I say this only as a generally interested citizen who also cares deeply about not just my country and my city and my town and my state, but also that we live in a very connected world where progress in any one country cannot be to the exclusion of another country, and that we can look to a much more peaceful, much more sustainable world order going forward, and not a lot less conflict and a lot more positivity and a lot more positive thought.
We all need that in the wake of the COVID pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine
Exactly.
war. That is exactly what the world needs. Mr. Minister, I know you have to go, but I just want to ask you last one or two questions that are directly relevant to your ministry very quickly. Concerns about the data protection law. It is being said that citizens' privacy might be in jeopardy. The government probably has unbridled powers to access and use our data. How would you address those concerns very quickly?
Look, the only response is please do read it. And before jumping around with these characterizations, it is an absolutely well drafted protection that at the heart of it protects the citizens' rights to privacy and gives a framework of guardrails that protects the citizens' rights without any ambiguity. And if there are any exceptional powers given to the government, these are powers to be used and exercised during emergencies like national security emergencies, a pandemic, and natural disaster. I have to go. I have a meeting.
All right. Thank you very
Thank
much,
you very much.
Mr. Minister, for making the time. Thank you very much.
मैं इमरान अहमद खान नियाजी सबके दिल से हल्फ उठाता हूँ.
When Imran Khan came initially into politics, he thought his personal popularity would be sufficient for him. It didn't happen.
The retired military generals are openly saying that Imran Khan is a better choice.
Imran Khan may have bitten a bit too much, more than what he can chew.
Implosion. This and more. Streaming on world's first news OTT. News9 Plus. Download now. China won't let us rest easy on our borders, but they will keep flooding our markets. What does Xi Jinping really